Believe me.
So
Just have to find it. I think I found it. Did I do? How do I get rid of that bubble? Okay. Why do I always have to swap? Okay. Didn't earlier. Okay, thank you. And how do I do that? That one?
This is what people are saying.
We'll give this a try. Okay, so we are going to talk about CARES because we had some questions about it, and probably last year we really focused more on getting this information out to your auditors. And I know there's still a lot of questions even for your auditors. And so we're going to kind of look back over that. Besides which, as we've already talked about, there's a new funding program, the American Recovery Plan. And so it's a good idea to keep some of the things we learned from CARES in mind. As Ricky said, it is really good to be back together. We have learned a lot, and we've learned some benefits for virtual. We don't like it 24/7, which is what we've been living for the last year. But for single topics like this, it does have its benefits, and this was one of them. If we had the information and could have done a 1-hour session and just invited everyone into it, which was possible, anyone that wanted to hear and do it on CARES, it would have given a lot of information out. Part of the problem with that was that, and what you'll find out with the American Recovery Plan, is it changes almost daily. It is so hard to stay on top of what happens. What they did with the CARES and what they're doing with the American Recovery Plan is they know that the money is important. They're getting it out as quickly as they can. So the money comes first, and then they start refining what it can be used for. So they give some general uses, and then they start thinking about it. We're the audit agency. So we come in this year to audit what you did with that CARES money last year. And now we're looking at this is the final things that we want. And so we're kind of juggling, where were we at when you spent this money? What were the guidance at that time? And so it is it becomes very difficult to navigate all of that. And we all did the best we could. Our agency, your commissioners, your auditors, the AIC, everyone was working the best they could to get this information out and to use this money in the best possible way. So what was CARES? CARES stood for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economy Security Act. It was a $2.2 trillion economic stimulus bill that passed in March of 2020. In that bill, and there were other things, because you're all aware of that, it provided $150 billion of relief funds to states and local governments. There was also things like payment protection to small business loans, stimulus checks to individuals. I mean, there was a lot in that. But what we focused on was what actually was coming to state and local governments. If the local government had a population over 500,000, they received the direct aid from the federal government. And if they did not, then it went to the state. And so in Indiana, the only entity that got direct aid was Indianapolis-Marion County. They were the only one that was big enough. So for everyone else, the money came to the state, and it was allocated to the counties and the cities and towns by the state. So what could it be used for? Originally, and remember, I'm going back in history and going forward, but it was originally released. What they told us we could be used for were any necessary expenditures incurred due to public health emergency with respect to COVID. So all your COVID costs could be paid by this. The expenditures could not have been accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27, 2021, or 2020. 20, sorry. So to fix that one. So they're looking at your 2020 budget, which was actually passed in 2019. Okay. There was no way we budgeted for COVID. We didn't see it coming. But we did budget for 2020. And so what they're saying, if you already budgeted for it, you can't use this money. It was anything above that budget. So that's very important. So keep that in mind. Okay. The expenditures had to incur between the period that began on March 1st, 2020 and ended on December 31st, 2020. So you were supposed to spend it within 2020. This was later amended and extended this to December 31st, 2021. But originally it was 2020 or December 30th, 2020. You had to spend it in 2020. That also became very crucial in a lot of the decisions that were made. Okay. So when they're talking about the COVID expenditures, those were pretty obvious. Your PPE, your sanitizers, your barriers, your personnel costs, not what you had budgeted for, but your overtime, your additional workers to do testing, to do all of the COVID related costs that you had. Get my notes up. So you're keep in mind, you know, your health budget probably already had things in it like sanitizer or gloves. It just didn't have the volume that you were going to need for COVID. So the budgeted amounts could not be, but anything above and beyond that could be covered by that. How Indiana chose to do this was that they used the Indiana Finance Authority, or IFA, to distribute the allocation to the counties, cities, and towns. The executive of each unit in counties, that would be your commissioner, had to sign a certification agreement before the funds would be dispersed. This agreement is very similar to a grant agreement because it spelled out the uses of the funding and the consequences if the guidance wasn't followed, for the funding wasn't used the way it was supposed to. Basically, that means you'd have to repay it. So they had to follow the allowed uses for it or face potential of having to repay that. The way the state set it up, the county had to expend the money first for these expenses and then submit a claim to the IFA with documentation, the invoices, what was actually paid for those expenses. Then IFA would review those expenses, determine if they were allowable, and if they agreed that they were allowable expenses, they would then give a reimbursement to the county for those specific costs. So this is a reimbursement approach. Note, if the expense was determined by IFA not to be allowable, you wouldn't get the reimbursement. And the county was going to have to fund that. If they already paid for it, they were going to have to fund it through one of their county funds. For counties other than cities and towns, there was no separate allocation. So they had to apply either through the county or the city or town and use that unit's allocation. So your libraries, your special districts, your townships, if they had COVID-related costs, they had to apply through the county or through a city or town and run their expenses through there. And then it would come back to the unit and the unit would pass it through to those. It was the unit's choice. They didn't have to give the money to those other units like townships or special districts or libraries. It was up to your executive whether they wanted to do that or not. Okay. This is how it worked pretty much from March to August. By August, relatively little of the total allocation to the units had actually been drawn down. Remember, they had until December 31st. Here in August, we really hadn't drawn down much of what was been allocated for them. For your office, it's very possible that they were feeling things out. So IFA was willing to review projects and say, yes, we would pay for this, or no, this wouldn't be allowable. And so a lot of counties were turning in, not actually paying for them, but turning in projects. So they might have come to you and say, you know, what do you need? And you might have said, well, you know, I could use some more laptops, or I could use a scanner, I could use this or that. Those were then turned in. And if IFA said yes, then you go ahead and tell you to go ahead and purchase them and turn those costs in to get reimbursed. So a lot of that was going on in a lot of the counties. Again, this was through August, but then there was a big change that happened that we didn't see coming. In September, the federal government changed the requirements such that all payroll costs for public health, public safety employees were determined to be substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID-19 and could be reimbursed by CARES money. So even the costs that had already been budgeted for your sheriffs, your EMS, your health department, any of those frontline responders, all of their payroll could be submitted, not just their overtime or additional workers. So from the state's perspective, they were looking at probably two things. One, that not a lot of the money was drawn down. And two, a lot of what we were looking for in expenses were not necessarily going to be approved. As I said, as we rolled forward, as they refined or refocused what was going to be available or what's going to be allowable cost, they were questioning some things. So some big equipment purchases, the federal government was saying, well, wait a minute, why did you purchase that? You could have leased it for less money. That had never been in the original guidance. So that's an example where they're saying we probably wouldn't approve that. And so when the payroll became available as a cost, it became much more attractive. It was deemed to be eligible. And every county pretty much could get their entire allocation remaining with that payroll cost. Okay. So from IFA's point of view, they were like, stop this that we've been doing from March to August, turn in your payroll. All of your payroll. For your public health, not all your payroll, for your public health, your public safety people. So for those of you that may have started purchase processes thinking it was going to be allowable and you were going to get reimbursed, this kind of put some stops on it because all of those projects from IFA's point of view were put on hold. Even if they had received the claims, they were putting those on hold and putting priority on those public safety and public health payrolls. From IFA's perspective, they didn't see that as an issue really because the county was getting all of their money. At that point, they had, once they got the money, it was, they could do what they needed as far as they're concerned. You could do what you needed to do with it. And so it was a much simpler way of getting that money out. But for counties that already had processes in place, well, you know, it's like to derail those processes and start over. It doesn't always work as smoothly as you would hope. Originally, our guidance for the CARES Act, we sent out a memo in September 30th, 2020. And by the way, all of the memos for CARES Act and now the memos that we so far have issued for the American Recovery Plan are on our website on the homepage. So anyone can read them. If you have questions about it or interested in them, you can go there and read those. Our guidance was that you, because it was a reimbursement, you would actually take the money that you received as a reimbursement, the payment from IFA out of the federal money, you'd put it in the federal grant fund that you'd set up for this, and then you would move the expense. So for example, if something had been paid out of your perpetuation fund that qualified for the reimbursement, they would take the expense and reverse it out of your perpetuation fund, move the expense to the grant fund, which restored the budget, or restored, you don't have a budget, but restored your balance in your perpetuation fund. If it was a general fund budget, it would not only restore the balance, it would restore the budget as well, because you're reversing that expense, you're moving it then to the grant fund, to the federal fund. Okay, that lines up all of your expenses and reimbursements in one fund. Too fast. With the change to reimbursing the payroll costs, which were even for the budget amounts, restoring the budget wasn't quite as important as it was for the earlier costs. And we knew that the counties and the cities and towns needed as much flexibility as possible to use that money. And so the state examiner issued a directive, which we'll talk about in a second, but issued guidance saying, if you choose, the county executive could pass an ordinance, and rather than move the expense from whatever fund it was in into that grant fund, we would allow them not take audit exception if you took the reimbursed amount, once you put it in the grant fund, just transfer it to the general fund. At that point, it's general fund money. It can be spent on any legal purpose of the county. So any of the costs that are still out there could have been paid out of general fund. We know that didn't always happen, but technically it could be paid out of that general fund. That money was there. And at that point, it's no longer COVID money, it's general fund money. That confused everyone. So we issued a directive, and that directive is still on there. And then we did examples. If you have situation 1, do it this way. If you have scenario 2, do it this way. And we tried to adjust that. And believe me, Ricky and I, we took phone call after phone call after phone call. We were so over CARES before CARES was over us. It was very confusing, and and I know it got translated a bunch of different ways, and I talked to many recorders that got caught in the middle of that, and I understood, all we could say was they can spend that general money on those expenses. We can't make them because that's still a county decision. You had it en route to go the way you thought it was going to go, and that kind of got upended. And so I know that was an issue for a lot of counties, that it caused some problems. But from IFA, they were prioritizing that again, because in their mind was getting the money out to you as quickly as possible. All of the money was getting out. You could spend it for any legal purpose. You had the flexibility to do it. They weren't going to question the cost because the payroll was all deemed an allowable cost. So it worked from up here. It didn't always work when you got out there. So what some of you probably would find out was that even if IFA had given a pre-approval for your purchases related to COVID, equipment, laptops, scanners, whatever you were trying to buy, if your payroll costs were then sufficient to claim the remaining allocation, that purchase was never reimbursed. That was never run through IFA, and the reimbursement was not given to you. Okay. Again, the theory being just move to general fund and pay for that cost out of general fund. But it wasn't the true reimbursement you had expected to see. This goes too fast for me. So probably what happened to a lot of you is you were scrambling to make those purchases or find where you could pay for them, whether you're going to pay for them out of your general fund budget or your perpetuation fund, or get them to pay for it out of a COVID line in the general fund budget. So what you thought you had all your ducks in a row, they were suddenly scattered across the pond, and you had to try to get them lined up again. So it was a lot of work, I know. And again, to reemphasize, why did IFA go this route? Because they knew the payroll for public safety and public health would not be questioned, and the state would not have to repay any of the federal dollars, and the counties and the cities and towns would not have to repay any of those dollars if the purchases were questioned, because they knew the payroll would not be. From their point of view, it all worked, and they just weren't in the middle of the counties the way you were to see how it was working there. It was not a perfect solution. There were issues at counties. As I said, Ricky and I took so many calls on this, and a lot of them we couldn't answer other than to say, they can spend that general fund money on this. So the money is there. It hasn't gone anywhere. You can still spend it on this. So again, as I said, we were pretty much over CARES long before it was over us, but in the final analysis, counties received a whole bunch of money. The cities and towns received a whole bunch of money that they wouldn't have gotten. So even though there was a lot of red tape, there was a lot of changes, a lot of changing horses in midstream, it was probably still worth it to get that money. There were a lot of other grants that were funded by CARES Act, not just the money that came through IFA. So there were FEMA grants, there were HUD grants that helped pay for some of the testing and vaccination clinics. Some of that is still going on. Voting grants through the Secretary of State to help your clerk's office with trying to do the election during this time. CDBG grants, things like that. So there were other grants that were coming through this. What I've been talking mostly is and what you probably had the most dealing with the IFA grants. So any questions on CARES? We've probably heard them, but you could still stump us. So what's next? Oh. The new federal funding source in 2021 is the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Oh, go ahead.
I do have a question.
Hi, Lori. I'm Gina Pimentel, Lake County Recorder. We put up on the shields, whatever you want to call them, the sneeze shields or, for COVID. Okay, yeah. They're huge. They're all around our office. I did get a quote from our assistant that they're going to be $38,000 to take down. Can this money from the CARES Act be used for that? I don't know. We're debating, but yeah,
We're leaving ours up.
I don't think,
I'm sorry, 3,800. I mean to say 3,800.
I'm thinking leave them up till they fall down. Yeah. I think Ricky and I could take them down for cheaper than that.
I read the text too quick. $3,800. That money be used, do you think?
It was more for putting them up than it was taking it down, so I'm not sure whether it would be more of an operational cost now. Replacing them probably, but I don't know that removing them would be.
Teresa Petro, Johnson County Recorder. We purchased 2 complete laptops, scanners, barcoders, Epsons to work from home. We had never done that before. We had one employee that did work at home for 3 weeks until her doctor said, okay, your office is doing what you're doing. We turned that in to our EMS director, was the grant police, I guess. And we were told that they were only accepting claims for payroll. So when we're told things like that, do we just say, oh, okay, we can't do anything more? Or is that something that we could have called someone else? And I mean, maybe our county was big enough, our, emergency people took all the funds. I have no idea, but.
Yeah, that would be one where the follow through was they're using the payroll to get the money. But once that money came in, then it could become general fund money, and it could pay for these kinds of expenses because it was unanticipated revenue. It was the closest thing that we were going to get to revenue replacement in CARES. It wasn't called that, but it was the closest thing to that. So you could have pushed back to the, taken your plan to the commissioner and said, look, we need this as part of our emergency plan to be able to work from home. We need this, and seen if they wouldn't have just paid for it with that.
Well, and we pay 100% of everything from our perpetuation fund. We use no general fund for anything. So I think they just kind of thought, oh, you got money out there, you're paying everything anyway. So, I mean, I really did feel like that, but it was like, at what point do you push back and say, hey, we just want a little,
you know your county better than I do, but I probably would have pushed back at least a little bit, even if they still said no. At least you've gotten on their radar. Sure.
Still can push.
Yeah. Yeah, because the money,
So it's not too late to
No.
do that, right?
as long as they haven't spent it all and they've,
Right. Yes.
it should still be available. Yeah, you'd have to check with them and see. We're going to talk about this on Thursday as well, that particular part of it. Okay. Okay, I'm almost done. Oh, you're right. Okay, so what's next is the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. So this is a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus bill that was signed on March 11th, 2021. And it includes assistance to states and local governments. However, ARP differs from CARES, and one of the biggest differences is the money is coming directly to the county instead of flowing through the state. I'm going to get to that. So this would be an advance payment or advance grant, where CARES was reimbursement. You had to pay the expense to get it. So from our perspective, this is kind of a good news, bad news kind of situation. Good news, you don't have to wait for the money. You get it up front. You know, you're not relying on anyone else. You don't have to, it cuts the red tape quite a bit. It's coming directly to your county. Bad news, there's no oversight for screening of allowable expenses. It's all on the counties. You have to make sure that what you're purchasing is going to comply. You don't have anybody reviewing it to make sure that it's going to be an allowable expense, because if it's not, during the audit, if it's determined to be a questionable cost, you could have to repay that amount back to the federal government, and nobody wants that. The second part is, since you are receiving it directly, not you all particularly, but your auditor's office, the county's going to have to report on this. So they're going to have to do a lot more reporting than they did, where the IFA was actually reporting on the counties and cities and towns. They were turning the reports into the federal government. The second change is the county has until December 31st, 2024 to use these funds. So you got 4 years to spend the funding. So there's no rush to get it all out the door the first day. You've got time to look at it and make your plans. We're big on plans. We're nerdy little accountants and we are big on plans. You get 1/2 in May and then the remaining half 12 months later. No. No. She's asking, do you have to have a plan in place before you get it? And no, we're pushing the plan, but you still have to comply with the funding, and we're going to go over that in a little bit. But you don't have to show a plan to receive it. But one thing, if we learned anything from CARES Act funding, it can change at any given point in time. They can do anything from amend that act to refine their requirements to question, you know, we get Q&A. AIC through NACO is really good at staying on top of this and getting information out to you. So be sure and, you know, stay up with their website, and they frequently ask questions. We have a lot in from an accounting point of view. We have a lot of questions in that we have not gotten answers to yet that we hope we would have answers now about using the money, investing the money, things like that. And as we get it, we'll put it on our website as well. But just bear in mind that while we know we have out now, but it really isn't a whole lot of information. So what they've told us so far within the act itself, okay, is it may be used to respond to public health emergency with respect to COVID-19 or its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. You can also respond to the workers performing essential work during the COVID-19 public health emergency by providing premium pay to eligible workers of the county or providing grants to eligible employers.
Sorry. This is so virtual people can hear.
I'm sorry.
So my question on item number 2, respond to workers performing essential work during COVID. Essential work, if we didn't close our office because we had to process the documents and refinances, mortgages and deeds and all of that, is that an argument we could take to our commissioners to say, look, we didn't, our employees deserve this type of pay based on this. I think that's one of the things our commissioners are particularly struggling with as to whether or not they can pay employees.
We searched the entire bill. It does not define essential employees. So
Okay,
yes, I've heard it defined. Every single county employee would be considered an essential employee.
okay, that's all I needed.
So I don't know. I mean,
And so,
we've
like,
heard that,
give
but we
further
don't have any
guidance.
refinement of that yet or anything from, this is all we have. This is all we have so far.
During the height of COVID, we were told by the governor that anybody that's working like with the title companies and real estate are considered essential. So it did come from the governor's mouth, if that helps.
Yeah, I mean, if we were doing an audit today and this is all we had, we would certainly not take exception to it if that was part of the plan. But just bear in mind, as more comes out, that they can refine this. But this is what we know now.
Cheers.
Put
My
the other-
question is, do you think it'll, well, like you said, it can change at any time. Do you think it will expand to allow our offices to help with doing some major backloading to get more documents available online for title companies and people versus us doing it just like when in our office, we have 2 full-time and 1 part-time person. So, when we're not doing the daily work, we're doing that all the time. But would some of this money be allowed for us to have some of our other documents scanned and indexed to put more out there available?
I certainly think the argument can be made that that is a response with respect to COVID or any health emergency to make, because that the remote access to your records, not having to come in person, is certainly a response to the health emergency. But again, all we know is what we know now. The third one is as a revenue replacement. So this is provision of government service to extend the reduction of revenue of the county due to COVID-19 related to revenues collected in the most recent fiscal year. As David said, we're going to use 2019 as the base year. It's probably fairly easy for your counties to look at MBH distributions in 2019 and what they got in 2020, 21, 22. The more difficult are going to be some of your local fees, but you can certainly look at that. If your volume went way down in 2020 because your offices were closed, you can certainly look at the fees that you were charging. And if you can show there was a reduction, then it can be used to replace that revenue as well. And the fourth one is to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And that is all I have right now. Are there any questions still remaining?
Oh, hold on, we got one up here.
One quick question. In above under the ARP number 2, it says by providing premium pay to eligible workers of the county. What is premium pay?
It's an additional amount. So if you're getting $15 an hour, they can give you a premium up to $13 an hour more. It is capped. You have to read, I didn't put all of that in there, but if you go to our website and look at the whole memo, it does go into details of what that amount can be. Ricky?
I can't see. Who? Oh, sorry.
That poll was in my way.
What happens to the elected officials? Because I thought our wages were set, we couldn't earn anymore. If there's only 2 of you in the office, are you saying we can't have the premium pay?
It would be in direct conflict with that statute, and I'm not sure how we would resolve that, whether the premium pay would have to come the following year. You know, you couldn't get it in 2021, but you could budget for it or, you know, pay it in 2022, something like that.
Anybody else?
I don't see anyone.
Okay.
It's your turn.
Huh?
No, it's not.
No, we gotta introduce Amy.
Amy,
She's there.
I'm going to stop sharing. Giving me the technical stuff is not very good. Hi, Amy.
Hello.
Give us just a second and we'll get you set up.
I'm gonna make you a presenter, hopefully. Do I right click on it?
Yeah, just click on her name.
I did, nothing's happening.
Excuse me, I like stairs.
Oh, here it is.